When millionaire Yvain lost the woman who'd raised him and helped raise his mischievous triplet daughters, 9 nannies failed in just 1 week. Then came Phoebe, a gentle blonde with quiet resolve, sparking a story of trust, love, and family rebuilt. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and rate this journey from 0 to 10 in the comments. Enjoy. The rain-laced skyline shimmered in the distance as Yvain Prescott stood by the panoramic window of his 38th floor office, his reflection a fractured silhouette against the city's restless lights. He loosened his silk tie, a gesture born less from discomfort than from the weight of the morning's failure, the 9th in as many days. The latest nanny had lasted precisely 46 hours, walking out with her lips pressed tight and her resignation folded into her trembling hands, muttering something about the triplets being an unholy alliance. Outside, thunder rolled low, like an echo of the ache in his chest, while inside, silence pressed heavily against the glass walls. Yvain wasn't surprised. He had seen this exact scene too many times in the past week. Each departure, another reminder that his household had become a revolving door, a place where patience and goodwill went to die. And yet, what choice did he have? His daughters were 5 years old, all 3 brilliant and spirited, all 3 heartbreakingly unpredictable since Margaret died. Margaret had been more than a housekeeper. She had been the architect of his childhood, the quiet force who'd stood in the shadows while shaping his future. She'd been there for every scraped knee, every report card, every long night when his parents were too busy with their empire to notice the boy they'd brought into the world. And when his wife left after giving birth, leaving him with 3 identical pairs of brown eyes staring up at him, it was Margaret who stepped in without hesitation. She'd raised the girls as if they were her own granddaughters, patiently teaching them songs, weaving bedtime tales, and making breakfast feel like a ritual of belonging. But 6 months ago, pneumonia had taken her in a matter of days, and the heart of his home had vanished with her. Now, Clara, Sienna, and Hazel clung to each other like shipwrecked survivors, their laughter rare, their mischief sharper, their eyes wary of anyone who dared cross the threshold, claiming to care for them. The elevator's chime snapped him from his thoughts, and he turned to see his assistant leaning in the doorway with a clipboard. "Next interview's in 20 minutes, sir. Name's Phoebe Quinn, last on today's list." Yvain nodded, though the words, "last on the list," felt heavier than they should have. He had already begun to consider alternatives that tasted like defeat. Boarding schools, live-in au pairs from agencies with glossy promises, perhaps even relocating closer to his family overseas. None of it appealed to him. All of it felt like surrender. The truth was simple, though he loathed to admit it, even to himself. He wasn't equipped to manage fatherhood alone. His girls were clever enough to sense his uncertainty and wounded enough to use it as a shield. They had driven away 9 nannies in a single week, each one entering with confidence and leaving in emotional tatters. The memory of their tactics surfaced with reluctant amusement. Clara, filling a nanny's handbag with syrup packets, Hazel, hiding in the laundry chute for nearly an hour, Sienna refusing to speak a single word for 3 straight days. To outsiders, it would seem like bratty behavior, but Yvain knew better. They weren't just testing boundaries. They were testing permanence, waiting to see who would vanish like everyone else had. And though he'd tried to explain this to each new hire, most had treated it as a challenge to be solved rather than a wound to be respected. Inevitably, they failed. Standing now in his office with the muted hum of the city beneath him, he wondered how much longer the girls could live in this state of perpetual suspicion before the damage became irreversible. When Phoebe arrived, it was without the hurried footsteps or performative smiles he'd come to expect from job candidates. She entered as if she belonged, not in an entitled way, but with a calm assurance that seemed immune to the skyscraper's intimidation. Her hair was the color of wheat in late summer, loosely gathered at the nape of her neck, with rebellious strands framing her face. She wore dark jeans, ankle boots, and a cream sweater that looked chosen for comfort rather than show. Her eyes, however, were the most disarming part. Steady, green, and unflinching as she met his gaze. "Mr. Prescott, I'm Phoebe Quinn," she said, offering her hand. Her grip was warm, firm, and oddly grounding. He gestured for her to sit, and as she settled into the leather chair opposite him, he decided to be blunt. "You should know, Ms. Quinn, you're my last attempt. If this doesn't work, I'm changing strategy entirely." She didn't flinch. "What kind of other strategy?" He almost smiled at her directness. "Boarding school, full-time care staff, moving closer to extended family. Anything that spares the girls from another failed attempt at stability." Phoebe's head tilted slightly, her attention fixed not on the logistics but on him. "Tell me about them," she said. "Not their schedules, not their dietary restrictions. Just tell me about them." And so he did. Clara, the quiet observer who felt too much. Sienna, the sharp-tongued protector. Hazel, the dreamer with a defiant streak. He spoke of how they'd changed since Margaret's death, how they clung to one another, how they now slept in the same bed every night because separation, even for a few hours, felt unbearable. Phoebe listened without interrupting, her hands resting loosely in her lap. When he finished, she said, "They're not impossible. They're scared. Scared that while they're away, you won't be here when they come back. That's what happens when the most important person in your world disappears without warning." Yvain leaned back, studying her. There was no judgment in her tone, only a matter-of-fact empathy that unsettled him in its accuracy. Most candidates had arrived armed with strategies and behavior charts. Phoebe came with an understanding that couldn't be faked. And when she added, "I'm not here to replace Margaret. No one could. But I can try to earn their trust, one day at a time." Something in him shifted. He didn't realize it yet, but the door to his guarded home, and guarded heart, had just been nudged open. The black sedan eased through the wrought iron gates just after 7:30 the next morning, its tires whispering over the rain-darkened driveway, as Yvain stood at the front steps with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand. He had not slept much, though the reason had less to do with business meetings and more to do with the calm, unshakable voice of Phoebe Quinn echoing in his mind. The triplets were still upstairs, likely plotting new and creative ways to dismantle whatever final attempt their father had brought home, and he couldn't decide whether to warn Phoebe or simply watch what happened. The air smelled faintly of wet cedar and the roses Margaret had planted years ago, the ones no one had dared to replant since her passing. When Phoebe stepped out of the car, she carried no oversized bags, no folders of activities, just a slim satchel slung across her body and the same unhurried confidence he'd noticed yesterday. She glanced up at the house, its tall windows and stone facade almost daring her to turn back. And then she met his eyes with the smallest smile, as if to say she'd already accepted the dare. Inside, the mansion felt different in the morning light, less like a home and more like a museum curated for ghosts. Yvain led her to the breakfast room, where the table gleamed with untouched place settings, silver glinting in the pale sun. He kept the tone brisk, explaining the girl's usual routine, though he stopped himself when he realized her attention had drifted toward the staircase. Footsteps padded against the carpet, slow and deliberate until 3 identical figures appeared. Matching strawberry blonde hair, wide brown eyes, and expressions as guarded as soldiers behind fortress walls. Clara stood slightly in front, her hands clasped in that practiced stillness she used when sizing up strangers. Sienna's gaze was sharp, already calculating. Hazel tilted her head with feigned disinterest, the corner of her mouth twitching in what could have been either curiosity or a smirk. Phoebe's smile didn't falter. She didn't crouch to their level in that overly cheerful way so many nannies tried. She simply said, "Good morning, Clara, Sienna, Hazel. I'm Phoebe." Clara blinked. "How do you know our names?" Phoebe tilted her head just enough to make it seem like a secret. "Your father told me, and I listened." Hazel frowned as if unsure whether that answer was acceptable, while Sienna crossed her arms in silent defiance. Yvain waited for Phoebe to launch into a schedule or rules, but instead, she glanced toward the kitchen. "Do you usually eat breakfast here or in the garden?" The question was so casual it disarmed them. Clara murmured here. Before she seemed to realize she'd spoken, Phoebe nodded. "Then here it is." She poured juice without asking who wanted it, sliding the glasses toward them like an unspoken invitation. And to his surprise, none of the girls protested. It wasn't much, but it was more than the last 9 had managed on their first morning. As the meal unfolded, Phoebe didn't fill the silence with chatter. She let the girls speak when they wished, listening more than leading. When Sienna announced that she didn't like strangers in the house, Phoebe only replied, "That's smart," then turned the conversation to the strawberries on her plate, asking if they grew in the garden outside. By the time they finished eating, Clara had told her which windows caught the morning sun. Hazel had described the cat that came to the back gate, and Sienna had admitted she liked toast only if it was golden, not brown. Yvain watched all of it from the edge of the room, realizing she was already mapping them, not as obstacles, but as people. It was during the short drive to school that Phoebe revealed her first strategy. She sat beside Hazel in the back seat while Yvain took the wheel, holding her phone loosely in her hand. "You know," she said, glancing at the 3 of them, "sometimes when you're away from someone it feels like they might disappear." Hazel's eyes flicked up from the window. "Like Margaret," Clara whispered, and the name hung heavy in the car. Phoebe nodded. "Yes, but what if while you're at school I sent you a picture of your dad every hour, just so you'd know he's still here, still waiting for you?" The idea seemed to hover between skepticism and intrigue. Sienna raised an eyebrow. "Why would you do that?" Phoebe smiled faintly. "Because sometimes it's easier to believe in things when you can see them." The first photo arrived during their morning recess. Yvain at his desk, sleeves rolled up, glancing toward the camera with the faintest smirk. A second followed during math. Him sipping coffee in the library, sunlight cutting across his face. By lunchtime, the girls were competing to guess where the next picture would be taken. When Yvain picked them up that afternoon, Hazel was the first to speak, holding up Phoebe's phone. "You missed a spot," she said, pointing to a bookshelf in the background. "You should dust there." The tease drew a laugh from Phoebe, and even Yvain found himself smiling as the car wound back toward the estate. That evening, after the girls had retreated upstairs, Yvain found Phoebe in the kitchen, rinsing mugs. "The photos were your idea," he said, leaning against the counter. She glanced over her shoulder. "It's not complicated. They just need proof you'll still be here when they get home. For kids who've lost someone they loved, absence can feel like betrayal." He studied her, wondering how she understood so quickly what others had missed entirely. When she turned off the tap and faced him, there was no triumph in her expression, only quiet certainty. "Trust is built in small pieces," she said. "You can't force it. You can only keep showing up until they believe you won't leave." Later that night, as he passed the girls' bedroom, he paused. The 3 of them were huddled under the same blanket, their whispers muffled but unmistakably lighter than they'd been in months. On the nightstand, Phoebe's phone glowed with a new message. Tomorrow's first photo, already cued and ready. For the first time since Margaret's death, Yvain allowed himself to believe that perhaps the fortress around his daughters wasn't impenetrable after all. And somewhere deep inside, he knew the woman who'd walked through his gates this morning had already found the first crack in its walls. The following Friday began with a pale, cloudless sky, the kind that made the city feel deceptively calm, though Yvain suspected the day would test them in ways the weather couldn't predict. Phoebe had mentioned the night before that the school planned an art activity for Family Day. Something lighthearted on the calendar, but treacherous territory for 3 girls still learning to live with absence. He remembered Clara's face when Margaret's name was spoken, how her shoulders curled in as though bracing for a blow, and he had quietly debated keeping them home. But Phoebe had disagreed. Her voice, even as she told him, "Shielding them only delays the hurt. It doesn't stop it." Now, as they prepared for school, the girls dressed in near silence, their identical plaid skirts swishing as they moved. Hazel tugged her cardigan sleeves over her hands. Sienna stared at the floor, as if memorizing its patterns. And Clara, ever the quiet sentinel, avoided looking at anyone at all. Phoebe didn't push. She simply handed each girl a hair ribbon in a different color: blue for Clara, green for Sienna, yellow for Hazel, and told them she'd see them at pickup. The classroom was already buzzing with the rustle of paper and the faint tang of crayons when they arrived. Parents milled around with coffee cups, teachers guiding children toward easels. On the board, in cheerful handwriting, were the words, "Draw your family." The phrase might have been harmless to most, but Yvain saw Clara's fingers tighten on her backpack strap, saw Sienna's chin lift defensively, saw Hazel's eyes dart toward the door. Phoebe knelt beside them, her voice low but steady. "This is just a story in colors," she said, sliding fresh sheets of paper onto their desks. "There's no wrong way to tell it," Clara muttered. "Ours doesn't look like theirs," nodding toward classmates sketching smiling parents in neat suburban kitchens. Phoebe leaned closer. "That's the best part. It means yours is entirely your own." Something in her tone, free of pity and full of certainty, loosened the air around them. The girls picked up their crayons, though hesitantly. For the next half hour, Phoebe drifted between tables, letting the girls work without hovering. Yvain stood near the doorway, watching as the tension in their shoulders eased into concentration. Hazel was the first to fill her page. A sprawling scene of the back garden, with herself, Clara, and Sienna chasing the stray cat. Sienna's drawing was more abstract, bold strokes of green and gold surrounding 3 figures holding hands, each with hair the color of late summer wheat. Clara's was the quietest. A small group seated at a kitchen table. A 4th figure in the background, Margaret, sketched in soft pencil, her smile faint but unmistakable. When Phoebe saw it, she didn't comment on the sadness. She simply asked, "Do you want me in your story?" Clara glanced at her, then added a 5th figure with the same green eyes that now watched over her shoulder. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. By the time the teacher announced the end of the activity, the triplets were comparing drawings, laughing over Hazel's exaggerated whiskers on the cat. Yvain expected them to clam up again once they noticed other parents. But when a curious mother leaned over and said, "That's a lot of people for one family," Clara answered without hesitation. "It's everyone who belongs." Phoebe smiled faintly, not inserting herself into the conversation, but her hand rested lightly on the back of Clara's chair, a silent anchor. Yvain caught that detail, the way she occupied space without demanding it, and felt a flicker of something he couldn't yet name. Pride, perhaps, or gratitude, that tasted dangerously close to affection. Later, outside in the parking lot, the girls walked ahead, their chatter about whose drawing was most real, bouncing off the autumn air. Yvain slowed his pace to match Phoebe's, the crunch of gravel underfoot filling the quiet between them. "You handled that well," he said, keeping his voice low so the girls wouldn't overhear. She shrugged, but it wasn't dismissal. It was the humility of someone who believed the work belonged to the children, not her. "It's their story," she replied. I just make sure they have the crayons to tell it. He glanced at her, studying the profile that seemed carved from equal parts steel and softness. Most people would have tried to fix it for them, he said. Her eyes met his briefly. That's the problem. They don't need it fixed. They need it seen. Back at the estate, the girls spread their drawings across the dining table, arguing playfully about which should be framed. Sienna suggested putting all three in the same frame, because they're one big picture anyway, and Clara agreed before Phoebe could respond. Yvain found himself standing in the doorway, watching the scene as though it were a rare bird that might scatter if he moved too quickly. The house didn't feel like a museum in that moment. It felt, if only faintly, alive again. Margaret's absence was still there, but it no longer filled every corner. It had been joined by something new, something tentative but growing. That night, after the girls were asleep, Phoebe lingered in the kitchen, rinsing paint smudges from her hands. Yvain stepped in, holding Clara's drawing. "She put you in it," he said. Phoebe dried her hands, glancing at the paper. "That's her choice, not mine." He studied her expression, searching for some trace of pride, but found only quiet respect for the boundaries the child had chosen. "It means she sees you," he said finally. Phoebe's lips curved, though her voice remained steady. "Then, I'll make sure she never regrets it." When Yvain went upstairs later, he paused outside the girls' room, the dim nightlight casting soft shapes against the walls. On the floor beside the bed, the three drawings lay side by side, edges touching, as if they were meant to be one. He stood there for a long time, realizing that what had happened today was more than an art activity. It was the first time since Margaret's funeral that his daughters had dared to draw themselves into a world where someone new might stay. And somewhere deep inside, he knew that change had Phoebe's fingerprints all over it. The rain began as a whisper against the tall windows, a faint patter that deepened into a steady rhythm as the night unfolded. Yvain had been working late in his study, the glow of the desk lamp pooling over contracts and half-drunk coffee, when a sudden creak on the stairs caught his attention. He glanced at the clock, just past midnight, and pushed back from the desk. In the hallway, shadows stretched long across the polished floor, and then he saw her. Hazel, her cheeks flushed, hair damp with sweat, clutching a blanket in one hand. She didn't call for him. She didn't even seem to see him. She murmured one word, as if it were a lifeline. "Phoebe." Without thinking, Yvain scooped her up, feeling the heat radiating from her skin, and carried her toward the guest room where Phoebe stayed. Phoebe opened the door almost instantly, as though she'd been waiting. Her hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders, and she wore a faded t-shirt that made her look impossibly young and unguarded. When Hazel reached for her, Phoebe didn't ask questions. She simply took the child from Yvain's arms and pressed a cool hand to her forehead. "She's burning up," she said, her voice low but calm, as if the steadiness itself might lower the fever. Yvain hovered in the doorway, torn between letting her take control and insisting on calling the doctor immediately. "It's not just her," Phoebe added, glancing toward the hall. "I heard coughing from the twins' room too." Together, they went upstairs, and sure enough, Clara and Sienna were curled under the same blanket, both flushed and restless. Phoebe knelt beside them, coaxing them into sips of water, her touch light but certain, while Yvain fetched the thermometer and medicine. The storm outside grew heavier, rain streaking down the glass as lightning briefly lit the room. Phoebe moved between the three beds with an ease that made it seem as though she had always been there, adjusting pillows, smoothing damp hair from fevered brows, and murmuring reassurances that were more tone than words. Yvain found himself watching her as much as the girls, how she carried herself without haste, how she seemed to borrow strength from some inner reservoir he didn't fully understand. At one point, Clara whispered something he couldn't catch, and Phoebe leaned close, nodding, then replied softly, "I'm not going anywhere, not tonight, not ever without telling you." The words landed in the quiet like a promise, and Yvain felt a strange tightening in his chest. Hours passed in a slow rotation of cool cloths, small doses of medicine, and the gentle hum of Phoebe's voice. Around 3 in the morning, the girls finally drifted into a deeper sleep, their breathing even and untroubled. Phoebe straightened, rolling her shoulders as if she'd only just realized the strain. Yvain met her gaze, the dim lamplight catching the faint sheen of exhaustion on her face. "You didn't have to stay up the whole time," he said quietly. She shrugged, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I couldn't sleep knowing they were sick." He hesitated before asking, "You've done this before?" She gave a half smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Enough to know fevers feel worse at night." They stepped into the hallway, the sound of rain muffled now, and Yvain found himself reluctant to end the conversation. He gestured toward the small sitting room at the end of the hall, where a single lamp cast a warm pool of light. Phoebe followed, curling into one corner of the couch while he sat across from her. For a moment, they listened to the storm, the air between them carrying the quiet intimacy of shared vigilance. Then he said, "They called for you, not me." It wasn't an accusation, but the words were heavier than he expected. Phoebe's gaze didn't waver. "They knew I'd come, and they know you will too. You just don't show it the way they need yet." The honesty was gentle but unflinching, and he found himself both stung and grateful. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You've only been here a short time, but you've managed to reach them in ways I haven't for months. I'm not sure whether that makes me relieved or—" He trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. Phoebe tilted her head, her voice quieter now. "It's not a competition, Yvain. They don't love me instead of you. They trust me to be here because I'm here right now. Trust grows in the spaces between promises and proof." He let out a slow breath, absorbing that. "And what about you?" he asked finally. "Do you trust me?" Her smile was small, almost rueful. "I'm still here, aren't I?" The moment stretched between them, fragile but undeniable. There was something unspoken in her eyes, something that mirrored the pull he felt but wasn't ready to name. He wanted to thank her, to say something that matched the weight of what she'd done tonight, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, he rose and said, "Get some rest. I'll keep watch for the rest of the night." She stood too, brushing past him toward the hall, but paused with her hand on the doorframe. "If they wake," she said, "tell them I'll be here in the morning." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading into the quiet. When Yvain checked on the girls before dawn, he found them sleeping peacefully, their fevered flush gone. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and silvered by the first light. As he stood there, he realized the night had shifted something between all of them, not just the girls and Phoebe, but himself as well. For the first time in months, he felt less like a man managing a household and more like part of a family, fragile though it might be. And as he closed the door gently, he knew one truth with absolute clarity. Phoebe Quinn was no longer just the latest in the line of nannies. She was becoming something far more dangerous to his guarded life, essential. The week after the rainstorm passed in a blur of small victories, laughter at breakfast, an impromptu baking session that left flour drifting like snow through the kitchen, and quiet moments where the triplets leaned into Phoebe without realizing they'd done it. Yvain noticed it all, storing each fragment as proof that something inside his home was slowly healing. When the school's invitation to the winter concert arrived, printed on pale blue cardstock with silver lettering, he saw the spark of excitement in Hazel's eyes before she tried to hide it. Clara announced that they had been practicing for weeks, though Sienna muttered that the songs were boring before humming one under her breath. Phoebe handled the details, making sure their outfits were pressed, hair ribbons matched, and shoes polished, while Yvain arranged his schedule to leave work early that Friday. It would be the first public school event they'd attended together since Margaret's passing, and the unspoken weight of that was not lost on either of them. The auditorium smelled faintly of pine from the garlands strung along the walls, the stage framed by deep red curtains. Parents filled the rows, shedding coats and murmuring to one another, the air buzzing with anticipation. Yvain and Phoebe found seats in the middle, close enough to see the girls' expressions, but far enough not to be pulled into the crowd of eager photographers at the front. He noticed the glances almost immediately. Curious, assessing looks from parents who recognized him from business magazines or charity galas. Some were polite, others edged with the subtle sharpness of gossip, and a few lingered on Phoebe with a questioning tilt of the head. She seemed unaffected, her attention fixed entirely on the stage as the first group of children began to sing. Yvain leaned slightly toward her and murmured, "Ignore them." Her lips curved faintly. "I already am." When the triplets took the stage, dressed in matching cream dresses with satin sashes, blue for Clara, green for Sienna, yellow for Hazel, the room seemed to brighten. They sang with clear, steady voices, harmonizing in a way that only siblings could. And though Sienna kept her expression carefully neutral, Hazel beamed openly, and Clara's eyes searched the crowd until they found Phoebe. The song ended to warm applause, but before the children could leave the stage, the principal, a tall man with thinning hair and an overdeveloped sense of ceremony, stepped to the microphone. "Before we conclude," he said, "I'd like to thank the parents and guardians who support our students." His gaze swept the audience before settling, pointedly, on Yvain and Phoebe. "And perhaps remind all guests that our school maintains a high standard of conduct for anyone representing our families." The words landed with the weight of an accusation without naming one. A ripple of murmurs moved through the rows, and Yvain felt the girls stiffen on stage, sensing the shift even if they didn't understand it. Phoebe's back straightened, her chin lifting a fraction, though her expression didn't change. The principal smiled thinly, as though expecting his remark to go unchallenged. That was when Yvain rose from his seat. The movement drew every eye in the room, his height, and the tailored cut of his suit making him an unmissable presence. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying easily, without the aid of a microphone. "But I'd like to make something clear. Phoebe Quinn is not here as an employee. She is here as part of my family because that is exactly what she is." A silence fell, thick and absolute before the applause began, not from everyone, but from enough to drown the whispers. On stage, Hazel's face lit with relief, Sienna's lips twitched into a rare smile, and Clara exhaled as though a knot inside her had loosened. Phoebe's eyes met Yvain's, a flicker of something unguarded passing between them before she looked away, schooling her features into composure. The principal cleared his throat, mumbled something about community spirit, and dismissed the children. Outside, in the cool night air, the girls rushed toward Phoebe, chattering about how they hadn't expected Dad to say that out loud. Hazel clung to her waist. Sienna said it was about time, and Clara simply took her hand without speaking. Yvain stood a step back, watching the way Phoebe's face softened in their presence, the earlier tension replaced by a quiet steadiness. As the crowd thinned and parents drifted toward their cars, he moved closer. "You didn't have to defend me," she said, her voice low, but not cold. He held her gaze. "I wasn't defending you. I was telling the truth." The drive home was quieter than usual. The girls half asleep in the back seat, lulled by the hum of the engine and the afterglow of the performance. Phoebe sat in the passenger seat, looking out at the passing lights. Yvain wanted to say more, to tell her that the words had come without thought, that they felt inevitable. But he settled for the weight of the silence between them, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of things unsaid. When they reached the estate, Phoebe gently woke the girls, guiding them inside, while Yvain lingered by the car, staring up at the darkened windows of the house. Tonight had changed something, not just for the girls, but for him. The declaration had been public, but its impact felt profoundly private. Later, after the girls had gone to bed, he found Phoebe in the library, her fingers trailing over the spines of books she probably hadn't had time to read. "About earlier," he began, and she turned, one eyebrow raised. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said. "I know how these things work. People see what they want to see." He stepped closer, the lamplight catching in his hair. "I wasn't performing for them. I meant it. Your family, Phoebe, that's not up for debate." For a moment, she didn't reply, and he wondered if he'd pushed too far. Then she smiled, small, real, and fleeting. "That's a nice thing to hear," she said, "but let's make sure the girls believe it too." When he finally went to his own room, the rain had started again, soft and steady against the windows. He thought of the stage, the stairs, the murmurs, and the moment his words had cut through all of it. And he realized that for the first time in a long while, he didn't care what anyone outside those walls believed, because inside them, the truth was beginning to take root. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked among the usual stack of invitations, invoices, and neatly bound reports. Yvain noticed it, only because it lacked a return address. Its envelope plain except for Phoebe's name, written in a narrow, deliberate hand. He had been sorting the mail in the kitchen while Phoebe prepared breakfast for the girls, her hair tied back loosely, humming a tune from the school concert. He placed the envelope beside her plate without thinking, but when she slid a finger under the flap and began to read, the color drained from her face. She didn't speak immediately, but her grip on the paper tightened, crumpling the edges. When Yvain asked what it said, she hesitated, then handed it to him. The message was short, typed in black ink. "Leave this house and those children before you regret staying. Your past is not as spotless as they think, and it will come out." There was no signature, but the final line carried a weight meant to sink into the mind. Some reputations don't survive the truth. Phoebe didn't meet his eyes as she turned back to the stove, though the rhythm of her movements had lost its ease. "It's probably nothing," she said quietly, as though dismissing it would make it so. Yvain read the letter again, his jaw tightening. "It's not nothing," he replied. "Someone wants you out of here, and they're willing to get dirty to do it." The girls entered then, chattering about a school project, and Phoebe slipped the letter into her sweater pocket, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Through breakfast, she answered their questions and laughed at their jokes. But Yvain could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flickered toward the window as though expecting to see someone watching. That afternoon, the first sign of escalation came, not at the house, but online. A gossip blog known for its venomous takes published a post titled "Mysterious Blonde Moves into Prescott Estate. Nanny or something more?" The accompanying photo, taken from a distance through what appeared to be the school's parking lot, showed Phoebe bending to speak to Hazel while Yvain stood nearby. The article hinted at impropriety, stitching together unverified claims about influence over the triplets and living arrangements beyond professional norms. By evening, 3 other blogs had copied the piece, each adding their own speculation. Phoebe read one headline on her phone, her face unreadable, then set it down as though refusing to give it weight. But Yvain saw her hands tremble slightly as she reached for her tea. 2 days later, the rumors found their way into the school's corridors. Clara mentioned overhearing a teacher's aide whisper something about that woman in front of other staff. Sienna asked why people thought Phoebe wasn't really our nanny, and Hazel wondered aloud why strangers cared at all. Phoebe kept her answers simple. People make up stories when they don't know the truth, but Yvain could see the girls bristling, their newfound stability strained by invisible hands pulling at the seams. That night, when the girls were in bed, he found her in the library, staring out at the dark gardens. "Tell me who you think is behind this," he said. She shook her head. "I don't know. And even if I did, what would you do? Fight them in public? That only feeds them." He stepped closer, his voice firm. "I would protect you. That's not up for debate." By the end of the week, his suspicions sharpened into focus. An offhand comment from a mutual business contact led him to believe the smear campaign was orchestrated by Marissa Kellen, a rival entrepreneur with a history of using personal attacks to gain leverage. She had attempted to poach a major client from Yvain months ago, and when he blocked the move, her polite mask had cracked just enough to show the steel beneath. Now, it seemed she had found a softer target, Phoebe. Yvain debated confronting her directly, but decided that removing her leverage would be more effective. First, however, he needed Phoebe to stay. That chance came the following Sunday, when Phoebe quietly began packing a small bag. She didn't announce she was leaving, but the gesture spoke loudly enough. Yvain found her in the guest room, folding sweaters with the same precision she brought to everything. "If you walk out now," he said, leaning against the doorway, "you're giving them exactly what they want." She paused, her hands still on the fabric. "I won't be the reason your daughters get dragged through gossip." His voice softened, but his stance remained firm. "You're not the reason. You're the anchor. And if you go, they'll see it as proof that everyone leaves eventually. Don't do that to them or to yourself." For a long moment, she said nothing. Then her phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at the screen, her expression shifting, and handed it to him. It was from Clara's number, but clearly written with all three triplets input. "Please don't go. We already picked your seat at the breakfast table forever." Yvain felt his throat tighten. Phoebe closed the half-packed bag, pushing it aside. "Fine," she said quietly. "But if I stay, we fight this together." He nodded once, relief threading through his anger. That night, they sat at the kitchen table, long after the house had gone still, discussing strategies, limiting public exposure, documenting any further harassment, and preparing for a direct confrontation if necessary. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the windows, but inside, the air between them was steady, charged with a resolve neither had voiced before. Yvain realized then that the smear campaign had done something its creator hadn't anticipated. It had moved Phoebe from the margins of their lives to the very center, bound there not by employment, but by choice. And that choice, he knew, would be the thing Marissa Kellen could never undo. It was nearly midnight when Yvain finally had confirmation. The investigator he'd hired, a discreet, sharp-eyed man named Callum, sent a single text that cut through the quiet of the library like a blade. "It's Marissa Kellen. I have proof." Yvain's hand tightened around the phone, the light from the fireplace flickering over his jaw as if it, too, burned with anger. Callum's report arrived minutes later, filled with emails traced back to Marissa's assistant, payment records to the gossip blogs, and photographs taken by someone planted near the school. She hadn't simply whispered rumors. She had built an entire scaffolding of lies designed to paint Phoebe as a manipulative outsider. Yvain sat back, exhaling slowly, but the calm was deceptive. Beneath it, a storm gathered. This was no longer just about protecting Phoebe's name. It was about dismantling the arrogance of someone who thought his family could be weaponized. The next morning, he didn't tell Phoebe what he knew. She had taken the girls to a weekend craft fair, her laughter audible even as they came through the door with paper crowns and glittered ornaments. He didn't want to dim that brightness yet. Instead, he stepped outside to call Marissa, his tone cold enough to frost the air. "We need to talk," he said. There was a pause. Then her voice, smooth, feigning confusion. "Always a pleasure, Ivan. What's this about?" He didn't waste time. "You know exactly what it's about. I have every thread traced back to you. Every payment, every false statement. If you think this ends with whispers, you're wrong." She gave a soft laugh, the kind that pretended at amusement but reeked of challenge. "You could take me to court, but you'd drag her through it too. And maybe the whispers will stick anyway." His reply was clipped. "Or I could ruin you in ways that won't make headlines, but will leave you with nothing to whisper from." The silence on the line told him she believed him. Still, the damage she'd caused was already in motion. On Monday morning, Phoebe received an anonymous email repeating the same venom as the letter, this time attaching manipulated photos to imply a romantic relationship with Yvain before Margaret's passing. The girls didn't see the images, but they felt the shift in the air. Clara grew quiet at breakfast. Sienna picked at her food, and Hazel asked if Phoebe was going away again. That was when Phoebe made the decision. She hadn't spoken aloud. She would leave. Not because she believed the rumors, but because she feared the harm they could cause the girls if the fire kept spreading. Yvain found her that evening in her room, suitcase open, clothes folded with the precision of someone forcing control over what they couldn't truly manage. "No," he said simply, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't look up. "It's the best thing for them. If I go, this stops." He stepped forward, closing the suitcase with one firm motion. "It doesn't stop, it just teaches them that lies win. And I won't have my daughters believe that." Her voice wavered, though she tried to keep it steady. "You're asking me to stay in a fight I didn't start." His gaze didn't waver. "No, I'm asking you to stay in a family you helped build." That night, she left anyway. She didn't slam doors or say goodbyes. She simply slipped out after the girls were asleep, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that read, "Tell them I love them, but they're better off without me in the middle of this." Yvain found it at dawn. The ink smudged slightly, as if her hand had shaken. The house felt cavernous without her. Rooms too quiet, breakfasts too formal. The girls' laughter muted, as if it had been carried off with her. For 2 days, he tried to keep the routine steady, but the strain was visible. Hazel refused to eat one night. Sienna skipped piano practice, and Clara asked if they had done something wrong. That question was what broke him. On the 3rd day, a package arrived for Phoebe, delivered by mistake to the estate. Inside was a handmade card from the girls, each having drawn a picture of themselves, holding her hand. Across the top, in uneven letters, they'd written, "Come home. We need you." Yvain didn't hesitate. He called her, the sound of traffic in the background when she answered. "They miss you," he said, voice low but unshakable. She didn't reply immediately, and he added, "I miss you. Not because you work here, but because you're ours. Come back, Phoebe. Not as help, as family." The silence on the line stretched until he almost thought she'd ended the call. Then she exhaled. "If I come back, I don't want to hear another word about employment contracts or job titles." He smiled, though she couldn't see it. "Good. Because the first thing I'm doing when you walk through that door is tearing yours up." That evening, as the winter light faded to gold, she returned. The girls ran to her as though the days apart had been years, clinging to her until she laughed, the sound ringing through the hall like a bell. Yvain stood back for a moment, taking in the sight, the center of gravity restored, the house alive again, and knew there had been only one possible outcome all along. The evening Phoebe returned, Yvain kept his word. After the girls had reluctantly gone to bed, He found her in the kitchen making tea, the soft lamplight gilding her hair. Without preamble, he set a single sheet of paper on the counter, her employment contract, and tore it cleanly in half, then into quarters, letting the pieces fall into the wastebasket. She raised an eyebrow, though her lips curved slightly. "That's dramatic," she murmured. He met her gaze without flinching. "It's honest. You're not an employee anymore. You're family." For a moment, something unguarded flickered in her eyes, and then she stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'd better start acting like one." The shift was immediate, though not in the way Ivan expected. It wasn't grand gestures or declarations. It was in the morning pancakes with all three girls crowded around the counter, in the way Phoebe's keys now hung on the hook by the front door, in the evenings spent on the couch where the girls piled into her lap without hesitation. The gossip blogs faded as quickly as they'd flared. Marissa Kellen's influence waned once Ivan quietly dismantled her business alliances, leaving her with no audience for her whispers. What remained was the quiet solidity of a household rebuilt, not identical to the one Margaret had shaped, but strong in its own way. Spring arrived in a burst of pale blossoms along the garden walls, and with it, a new kind of rhythm. One Saturday morning, Phoebe joined Ivan in the garden, where the girls were weaving flower crowns. Hazel presented hers with great ceremony, placing it on Phoebe's head. "Now you're officially our mom," she announced, grinning. Phoebe laughed, but the word landed with unexpected weight, not just for her, but for Ivan, who caught the flicker of surprise in her eyes before she leaned down to kiss Hazel's forehead. Later that night, he asked her quietly, "Does that feel strange?" She shook her head slowly. "No, it feels right." By early summer, the conversation they had both been avoiding finally surfaced. They were sitting on the terrace after dinner, the girls chasing fireflies across the lawn, when Ivan said, "I've been thinking about making it official." Phoebe looked at him, a question in her eyes. "Official?" He nodded. "Not just in this house, not just in how we live. Legally. You as their mother." She didn't answer immediately, watching the triplets laughing under the fading sky. "If we do that," she said finally, "it's forever. Not because of a piece of paper, but because they'll believe it is." His reply was steady. "That's the point." The adoption process was both swift and strangely anticlimactic. The court appearance lasted less than an hour, but when the judge signed the final document, the triplets cheered as though they'd won a championship. Clara slipped her hand into Phoebe's without a word. Sienna whispered, "Now you can never leave." And Hazel, always the boldest, said, "You should marry Dad too." Phoebe laughed it off in the moment, but the suggestion lingered in the air between her and Ivan, like the faint scent of lilacs drifting in from the garden. It wasn't until months later, on an autumn morning when the first leaves had begun to fall, that Ivan took her for a walk along the estate's south path and asked her outright. The wedding was small, held in the garden where Margaret's rose bushes bloomed in late defiance of the season. The triplets stood as bridesmaids, each carrying a single white rose, and when Phoebe walked down the aisle, there was no trace of the quiet stranger who had arrived months ago. She was luminous, steady, entirely at home. Ivan couldn't recall the words he spoke to her at the altar later. They blurred into the memory of her hands in his, the sound of the girls giggling behind them, the certainty that he had chosen not just a partner, but a co-architect of the life they now shared. A year later, the house was louder than ever. The triplets had grown taller, their laughter echoing down the halls, and Phoebe, now visibly pregnant, moved through the days with the same calm certainty that had once quieted their grief. One afternoon, she found Clara in the kitchen, sketching a picture for school. It showed all of them together, Ivan, Phoebe, the triplets, and a small figure labeled Baby. Clara held it up shyly. "I wanted to make sure they know they're already part of the family," she explained. Phoebe kissed the top of her head, her voice warm. "They will. Because you'll show them." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Ivan reached for her hand. "Do you ever think about how it started?" he asked. She smiled, her thumb brushing over his knuckles. "I think about how it almost ended," she said, "and how glad I am that it didn't." He squeezed her hand gently. "We made something here. Not perfect, not planned, but ours." In the nursery upstairs, a crib waited beside a wall of hand-painted constellations. Hazel's idea, ready for the next chapter of a story that had begun with loss and stubborn hope. And when the baby finally arrived, the triplets took turns holding their sibling, each whispering their own promises. Phoebe watched them from the rocking chair, Ivan standing beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. The house was full again, of noise, of chaos, of the kind of love that grew not from obligation, but from choosing every day to stay. And in that moment, she knew the truth she would carry for the rest of her life. Families aren't simply born. They are built piece by piece by those who refuse to let go. Thank you for joining this heartfelt journey of love, resilience, and the power of chosen family. Every chapter was a step from loss toward healing, proving that sometimes the people who change our lives the most arrive when we least expect them. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share what touched you most and where you're listening from. And don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Until we meet again for the next tale, take care and keep believing in new beginnings.